So welcome to our webinar on scheduling high impact tutoring. This is brought to you through a partnership between TEA and Amplify. We're excited to share with you some of the research on scheduling of high impact tutoring, as well as some of those promising practices and examples that will hopefully be useful to you in implementing high impact tutoring in your schools. This session is being recorded and the recording will be shared with you after the session is over. So let's begin with a poll. I'd just like to know where you are currently in your planning and thinking about scheduling high impact tutoring. So I've put together a quick poll. Where are you in your high impact tutoring program design process? Are you still putting together a plan? Are you working on finalizing a plan? Do you have a plan and now you're implementing it? Or have you actually been doing tutoring and so now you're looking for ways to improve? So go ahead and answer the poll. Looks like we're about at 50% of our participants having participated. I'm going to aim for pretty high response rate here. So I'm going to give people a little more time to answer. Would love to see response rate or hovering around 75–80% before I end the poll. We're at a little over 60% now. So where are you in your high impact tutoring program design process? And in other words, how are you thinking about tutoring in your master schedule? All right, I'm going to give 30 more seconds because we're almost to 75%. Love to see more people answer. All right, I'm going to end the poll. Let's share results here. So it looks like almost 60% of you are still putting together a plan. That's totally fine. And then about a quarter of you are working on finalizing a plan. And then about 18% of you are either have a plan and are starting to implement, or you've been implementing and you're now looking for ways to improve. So this is good to know for us. I think if you are still putting together a plan or working on finalizing a plan, you may have some more flexibility in your schedule to think about where high impact tutoring fits in. If you have a plan and starting to implement it, think of this webinar as a way to tweak some of your ideas and just make sure that what you're doing is both meets the needs of high impact tutoring and also is in compliance with HB 4545. A little bit about myself before we get started. I know some of you already through some of our high impact tutoring work, but for those of you who don't, my name is Jess Chung. I'm the Associate Director of Tutoring at Amplify, and I'm based on the West Coast in Seattle. Some of the things I'm passionate about are equity for students, supporting diverse learners, and making sure our students are taken care of in both their health and wellness as well as academic achievement. And I've developed and delivered professional development for schools, districts, and also 21st century community learning centers, both domestically and abroad. A few housekeeping details before we move on. You are all currently on mute, but you can ask questions in the Q&A box. If you send a chat message, it will go to me and the panelists. We have two panelists, both from TEA, Colby and Joe. They will help with answering questions at the end if there are questions for them. And as I mentioned earlier, we are recording this session. We will also send you the slides of this deck as well as a handout that has all of the examples and resources that we talk about during the session. So don't worry about taking pictures of slides, any of that stuff. All that information will be sent to you. A quick overview of the objectives for the session. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at what is high impact tutoring and what is some of the research around scheduling as the design principle of high impact tutoring. Then I'm going to go quickly over some of the principles, processes, and tools for master schedule redesign and how to apply those to high impact tutoring. And then we'll spend the majority of our time really looking at some of the promising practice and some master schedule examples that integrate high impact tutoring, mostly during the school day, but also some examples of before and after. So here's our agenda for today. You can see that first we're going to get into high impact tutoring and scheduling. So let's start by actually defining what high impact tutoring is. So the National Student Support Accelerator, also known as NSSA, has been one of our go-to resources when it comes to designing and implementing research-based effective tutoring, what you'll hear called high impact or high dosage tutoring. And they define tutoring as a form of teaching one-on-one or in a small group towards a specific goal. High impact tutoring leads to substantial learning gains for students by supplementing but not supplanting students' classroom experiences. High impact tutoring responds to individual needs and complements students' existing curriculum. And the important thing to focus on here is this idea of supplementing but not supplanting, as you will see that language appear both in high impact tutoring as well as HB 4545. A big question has come up for us throughout our time working with different LEAs and ESCs on high impact tutoring, and then talking about HB 4545 is what is the difference between those things? Are they the same? And so we put together this top hat organizer for you to look at and think about what are the big differences. So you can see here that one of the big differences is that high impact tutoring is really effective for our pre-K through 12 students, whereas HB 4545 is really specific to grades 3 through 8 and those students who took the EOC assessments. Obviously, high impact tutoring can be both required or voluntary, but HB 4545 is going to be required for those students who fail to perform satisfactorily on the STAR. Remember that any student who did not pass STAR grades 3 through 8 or EOC must either be assigned to a classroom teacher who is certified master, exemplary, or recognized, or receive accelerated instruction such as tutoring. Under HB 4545, the dosage of supplemental instruction is 30 hours of instruction, at least one session a week during the school year in that content area that the student did not meet satisfactory on the STAR or EOC. But when you look at high impact tutoring, you can see that the highest effect sizes are really for those 10+ week programs with tutoring sessions that are 3 to 5 times a week, and then at least 30 minutes per session, ideally between 30 and 60 minutes. You'll also see some of the similarities here. You'll see that both high impact tutoring and HB 4545 require that the tutoring supplements core instruction and does not supplant it, that it utilizes high quality instructional material that is designed for supplemental instruction. In other words, tutor-friendly, skills-based curriculum. And when I say tutor-friendly, I mean materials that a tutor on their first day of school could pick up and start delivering tutoring sessions right away using those materials. That assumes that they've also been trained, and that, again, is a similarity as well. Employing well-trained, consistent tutors. Consistency is a big deal for both high impact tutoring as well as HB 4545 with ongoing support and oversight from program leads. I also will note that tutoring can be delivered using an online program, either in person or virtually, but the online program must be facilitated by a tutor that meets the requirements defined in HB 4545, which includes what we put on this slide, that they have received training in alignment with those instructional materials, and that the same tutor is assigned to the student for the duration of that supplemental instruction for as much as possible. You'll also see a little bit on student to tutor ratio. High impact tutoring is effective for up to 4 to 5 students per trained tutor. Under HB 4545, the student to tutor ratio must be 3 to 1 or less unless you have received parent authorization, parent or caregiver authorization. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about scheduling in terms of high impact tutoring. So scheduling as a design principle for high impact tutoring refers to where and when tutoring sessions take place. So does it take place in school during the school day, in school, in a school building, but after the school day or before the school day, or is it taking place outside of the school? So that's what we mean when we talk about scheduling, talking not just about when, but also where. When we look at the research on scheduling as it applies to high impact tutoring, we're really seeing that in the aggregate, during school programs have an effect size that is nearly twice that of after school programs. So an effect size of 0.4 versus an effect size of 0.21. That said, some of the magnitude of the difference could be in part due to the fact that most teacher and paraprofessional tutor programs, which tend to be more effective, are conducted during school hours. We also know that high impact tutoring programs that are held during the school day tend to be more accessible to our students than those held before or after or during intersessions. That said, there still is a positive effect size for tutoring that takes place during, the after school, before school, after school intersessions and Saturdays, especially when they're combined with other design elements of a higher effect size, such as frequency, a well-trained, consistent tutor, and a skill-building curriculum that is designed for supplemental instruction. And you'll see some of the best practices on the slide that reflect some of those things, so some of those other high impact design principles. I do want to make a note as well that we do want to think about avoiding as much as possible those scheduling models that will stigmatize students who are receiving tutoring. Obviously, we want, even if tutoring is required for specific students, we want students to feel like tutoring is something that is helping them and also not making them feel like they're being singled out and put in sort of a negative headspace because of it. A few reminders about scheduling tutoring under HB 4545. Under the statute, students cannot be removed from instruction in grade level content for foundation curriculum or instruction in enrichment curriculum or recess or physical activity. So we're really looking at a definition that is specifically about supplementing or in addition to this instruction. If you have specific questions about HB 4545, I'm going to put, I'm going to encourage you to look into the HB 4545 FAQ. That link will be shared with you as part of the materials, but there's a lot of clarifying questions that have come through based on that. So I will share those with you after this webinar is over. So now that we've talked a little bit about high impact tutoring and scheduling, let's talk a little bit about the tools and principles and processes you can use to schedule high impact tutoring into your school day. So the principles of master scheduling are going to hold for us as we think about high impact tutoring. Of course, every decision really needs to be informed by data, not just scheduling of high impact tutoring, but all the things that we do to improve learning for our students. We mentioned before this idea of not stigmatizing students or not making students feel stigmatized because of high impact tutoring. So this idea of equitable access and also thinking about how students are accessing those services, making sure that as we schedule tutoring, we're thinking about how to make sure that students can get to that tutoring service. Obviously prioritizing the student and teacher experience. I know there's a lot of concern about teacher burnout, and that's very legitimate. So thinking about that, as well as what's best for students. And then, of course, strengthening and sustaining instructional priorities and being responsive. So we know that we may have to make some quick changes at the beginning of this year in terms of accommodating high impact tutoring. This is flexible. We can revisit some of our decisions. We can figure out what will make it better. Making a change to your master schedule now doesn't mean that you can't change direction slightly in the future. And we would encourage you to reflect on how things are going and whether the path that you've chosen initially is the best path. So along those lines, we encourage you to, as much as possible, use this process for a strong master schedule. And we recognize that this is a process that is for ideal circumstances. So, most of you will probably use some sort of abbreviated process in the fall with an eye of revisiting the schedule in the spring. And this is an iterative process. So it's not going to be something that is one and done, but it is something that you're going to work on over time. So just a quick overview. Obviously, you want to have a team that's working on this, thinking about what is the timeline for this, what are the priorities that you want to focus on, how will you collect and review the data, and what stakeholder approvals do you need? And then moving on to building, we'll show you some tools you can use to draft your schedule. You obviously want to collect some feedback and iterate on the plan itself and then finalize. And then of course you want to communicate that schedule and then implement and evaluate it and adjust it like we said. Again, we expect that there will be adjustments along the way and that this is a long-term process, not one that you will do once this fall and then keep for the rest of the years coming forward. We know that things change and you'll need to respond to those changes. So some recommendations and guidance from TEA as you think about scheduling high impact tutoring is you want to identify your scheduling priorities first, like we said in the earlier slide, and make sure you have some non-negotiables that you're working from. You want to think about some innovative solutions, and we'll show you some in just a second about blocking and rotations and possibly even blended learning. You may want to think about extending your school day or making the most of other opportunities for tutoring. I mentioned Saturdays, intersessions, as well as during or before after school. Perhaps leveraging some of the resources you have to purchase time-saving scheduling software if that's in your budget. And then potentially planning a second schedule that varies the time allotted for tier 2 at key intervals, or just planning time to revise schedules throughout the year. So I want to quickly show you a tool that you can use to start tracking your instructional time, and just that will give you some different ideas of the types of blocking that you can do. And this is free. So this is the schedule library from Unlocking Time. You can take a look at the different types of blocks that are available to you to use in your schedule. And then there is a Bell schedule builder. So if you want to start building a schedule and experimenting, this is what I would recommend that you go into. And I see a question in here about whether you will have a copy of the slides, and the answer to that is yes. Yeah, you will not only have a copy of the slides, but you will also get all the links that I either share or talk about. So don't worry about that. Like I said, you don't have to take pictures of the slides. You will get all the slides after the session is over. Some other tools or resources that we recommend you look at are some tools from NSSA. They actually just released a High Impact Tutoring District Playbook, which has a lot of great tools and resources. ERS has 3 steps to a strategic schedule. If you sign up for a free account, you get access to their tools for creating a schedule. CCASN, which is based in the University of California, Berkeley, has a guide to support schools that are using a linked learning approach or wall-to-wall or multiple pathways approach to redesign high schools specifically. And then an article that I think is very helpful is Reimagining the School Day. This isn't specific to tutoring, but it shows you some examples of innovative schedules from schools around the country that include additional time for planning and collaboration. And of course, tutoring can be part of that as well. And we'll show you some examples of flexible instructional blocks to differentiate content for student need, and also opportunities for small group instruction or student-directed learning. So that would be a list of resources to really just get you started in this process. So finally, let's look at some of those promising practice for and scheduling examples for high impact tutoring. So here are some of the recommended approaches, both from NSSA and our own experience working with high impact tutoring programs. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at an example of each of these as we go through. We know that finding time during the school day can feel daunting. And so this is just to show you that there are a lot of different approaches available, and that you may need to try out a few different approaches throughout the year, depending on what seems to be working or what isn't quite working yet. So flex blocks are usually is usually the easiest sort of approach to start with. Many schools already have a consistent period that's flexibly used, such as lunch, advisory, or homeroom. And so these periods can be repurposed for tutoring. Some suggestions regarding different types of schools. So for high schools, if you want to boost attendance and tutoring, you may want to avoid scheduling tutoring during the first or last period of the day. And then for elementary and middle schools, if your tutoring program model relies on high school tutors, and I know some of your LEAs are thinking about that in terms of using high school tutors who are trained and consistent for tutoring, you will want to coordinate with your high schools to make sure that you are aligned in terms of your flex blocks. On the slide, you'll see an example of flex block tutoring. You'll see that the lunch was used as a flex block, so you had tutorial A and B where students could attend. And this is an example from Texas, by the way. When what I need time is a school-wide common time for targeted interventions and extensions. So again, going back to this idea of not stigmatizing students who are receiving tutoring, but making it something that feels much more universal. So during WIN time, all adults in the building are working with all learners to meet their needs. There is a great webinar on WIN time put out by TESPA, and that will be linked in the handout that we send you after this. But you can see here that part of it is a talk with the principal of Mockingbird Elementary and Coppell ISD, and they talk about their WIN time, which ran from 7:50, which was right after their morning announcements, to 8:20 Monday through Thursday. Obviously, intervention periods are another great way to integrate tutoring, as many schools already have this as part of your schedule. You can use these to leverage tutoring. Hybrid models especially can be promising, as you can allow different groups of students to receive both in-person and virtual tutoring within the same space. And students receiving virtual tutoring will obviously need their own device and headphones to participate. So we're going to show you two different examples of schedules that incorporate intervention blocks to make the most of time for tutoring. So here you see an elementary schedule where lunch recess camp, which is computer, art, music, and physical education, and intervention is scheduled throughout the day for each grade level. And here is a sample middle school with intervention time scheduled in. And just so you know, I am keeping track of the questions that are coming in, and we will have some time at the end to answer some of those questions. Parallel, or what some people call them double blocks, are common in elementary schools, both for reading and math usually. And then in a double block or parallel block, you can set aside time for both whole group and then tutoring within some sort of station rotation is usually how you do it in this kind of model. So I have an example on the slide here that you can see that about half of the time is focused on that core instruction, and then the other half, the 45 minutes, is focused on supplemental instruction. And what this looks like in this schedule is really the teacher working with 5 different groups of students. Some are doing independent work in rotation. Some are meeting with the teacher or tutor for tutoring specifically. And you see that each numbered groups of their 5 groups, 1, 2, 3 on Mondays would receive tutoring at some point during that rotation. And then on Tuesday that should say 4, 5, I don't know why 5 was doubled. I apologize for that misprint right there. But you can see that throughout the week, then every group gets touched with tutoring during that supplemental instruction time during that parallel block. If you're wondering what that might look like on the high school level or middle school level, this is an example of a schedule that mixes both traditional and what are called AB blocks. And you can see that throughout the week, all students will get every single class, 1 through 8, periods 1 through 8, 4 times. but then on Wednesdays and Thursdays, they have an extra long block for certain periods. And that allows for time for supplemental instruction to be built into that longer period of time. So core instruction can still take place, but there's also still supplemental instruction as well. And then some considerations for tutoring outside the school day. We talked about not stigmatizing and equitable access. And so some important considerations you will need to have for tutoring outside the school day is that you need to think about that transportation for students to reduce barriers to accessing tutoring. One of the things you may want to think about is serving and working with students and caregivers on other issues that may impact attendance and equitable access. So thinking about our high school students who may have after-school jobs to support their households or take care of younger siblings. You want to also think about those potential conflicts with extracurriculars as well. And then we would highly recommend that if you are thinking about after-school programming for tutors, that you also think about how you can integrate with some of your existing programs, whether you have the 21st Century Community Learning Center or ACE program at your school, or already have some Saturday or an Ascension programs. How can you leverage those programs to implement high impact tutoring that also is in compliance with HB 4545? And also remembering, as in that integration, that tutoring does need to be led by a trained tutor who's utilizing those high quality instructional materials designed for accelerated instruction. And students can also be tutored during the summer. So if you are thinking about that, we encourage you to start planning that now so that you can ensure that your program is both effective and in compliance with HB 4545. One of the resources we highly recommend you view if you're thinking about after-school tutoring is the presentation that Ector County ISD did on one of the TEA webinars on their after-school one-to-one virtual tutoring program. We will link this in the handout that you will get at the end of the webinar, after the webinar, along with the recording. But we highly recommend you look at the ways that they reduced barriers through providing transportation. And also they really used an interesting outcomes-based contract with their tutoring provider, which is outside the scope of this specific webinar, but something you may want to explore and reach out to Ector County about as well. And then finally, one of the approaches that you may want to think about is this idea of recovering instructional time. So the Center for Student Achievement Solutions has an example where they show how up to 129 minutes of instructional time can be lost between class transitions, activity transitions, bathroom breaks, and discipline throughout the day. And so this idea of providing students with clear routines and procedures for transitions and supporting teachers with some strategies for minimizing the loss of instructional time will allow for maybe some recovery of that time and potentially banking that towards tutoring. And I think all of us can agree that the idea of recovering instructional time is important, even if that recovered instructional time is not specific to tutoring. But that is something you may want to think about if that fits with your campus plan and some of the school's improvement goals. You may want to think about how setting some of the goals for supporting your schools and recovering lost time to bank towards high impact tutoring may be a good strategy. So in the wrap up, I do want to look at some of the questions that have come through and offer some answers. You can also put in questions now. So one of the questions that came in was, when will we find the vetted programs we can use with T-class grants? And the answer to that is we hope to have information out late this week for you on that. There was another question, is there an approved list of approved materials to use for tutoring students? The answer to that is there's not a specific list of materials. It's up to the LEA to determine what materials to use. The subsidized provided materials that will come out later this week, hopefully, are specifically for tutoring. One note to that is any materials that you approve at the LEA level must be aligned to both TEKS and to your core instruction. That may seem obvious, but you want to make sure that tutoring is integrated as much as possible and supporting your core instruction. This idea of accelerated instruction, of course, with tutoring is that tutoring should be helping students access their core content. Another question is, If a student is assigned to a master exemplary or recognized classroom teacher, completion of HB 45 requirements is not required. And the answer is yes. So if they are assigned to a master exemplary or recognized classroom teacher, that is meeting the requirements of HB 4545. And so the 30 hours of supplemental instruction is not necessary because they've already met the requirements of HB 4545. And again, we will send you a link to the FAQ for HB 4545. And a lot of these questions are answered in that document. That document is also a living document online, so you will be able to see new answers come in to questions as you go along. If you do have questions specifically for TEA around high impact tutoring and scheduling, you can email them at texastutoring@te.texas.gov. We would ask that you complete the survey that is on the screen so we know whether this scheduling webinar was helpful for you. Again, we are sending you the slide deck, the recording, as well as a packet of resources. You can use the QR code or the link. And then I do see a few questions coming in the chat, so let me try to answer those. Do we still have to have the 3-to-1 student to tutor ratio for tutoring? The answer is yes. Under HB 4545, the student to tutor ratio is 3-to-1, unless you have caregiver authorization for a larger group. And then if tutoring begins before tutors are fully trained in high impact tutoring, can those sessions count towards the 30-hour requirement? One of the requirements of HB 4545 is that tutors are trained in the high impact tutoring materials that they're using. So I would look again at the HB 4545 FAQ, and there are some answers to that. And then Michelle asks if there is a waiver by TA the parents can use to waive the 3-to-1 option. Colby, do you want to answer that question?
Yes, can y'all hear me okay, Jessica?
Yes.
So on our last House Bill 4545 webinar, there was some resources debuted, and there is an example letter uploaded. I believe it's on the Accelerated Learning website that does provide a template to present to parents to waive the 3-to-1 ratio. Just a caution on that, high impact tutoring, again, is best practices of tutoring versus House Bill 4545 statutory requirements are the minimum requirements by law to provide students that did not perform satisfactorily on their STAR exams. So kind of talking about two different categories along the continuum here as well.
And then Colby, we have two more questions that just came through. One is about if a student is served under an IEP, would you recommend having a separate goal written for the interventions that are being provided? I believe the answer to that is that the students with IEPs are served by their ARD committees. That becomes their ALC. So whatever services they're receiving through their IEP becomes their plan under HB 4545. Is that correct, Colby?
Yes, somewhat. There's clarification in the last House Bill 4545 FAQ that goes into detail about ARD committees and their roles. And so I'll defer to please reference that for the latest information as I continue to update that on an ongoing basis.
Great. And then we had another question. Another two questions come into the Q&A. So the first one is, would workbooks such as Star Ready or Star Masters be appropriate for tutors to use?
I think it could be a resource used for House Bill 4545 requirements that they're TEKS aligned. But as for high impact tutoring, Jessica, there's so much more to that we need to look at. Would you agree?
I agree. I would really look towards materials that are skill building, and then specifically that are looking at acceleration. Like I mentioned before, we really want our high impact tutoring to be preparing students to access their core content and thinking about how we are prepping our students through that. And so while Star Ready, Star Masters may be appropriate in some cases, you will want to think about what is the overall approach of your materials and how do they really foster learning, deep learning so students can be successful in the classroom. Okay, and then we have a specific question about whether ARDs have to use the accelerated instruction template that is for ALC use. I don't know if this is answered in the most recent HB 4545.
So the documents that we've provided, like an ALC meeting agenda, are all just examples of what could be used. They're not mandated, not required. We do know that there are various special education programs used out there to track ARDs. I'm familiar with eSped. So there could very well be documentation within the ARD of the ALC's discussion and decisions moving forward with that. The forms we're providing are not required. That includes the data tracker for tutors. Those were all suggestions or drafts that we came up with out of a request from LEAs for examples of those.
Yesenia asks, what is the highest number recommended student to tutor ratio if we have to waiver? Yesenia, I would say that the research shows that obviously the most effective tutoring in terms of student to tutor ratio is 1-to-1. 2-to-1 and 3-to-1 are pretty similar in their effect size. There's no significant difference. And then we do still see an effect size for 4 to 5 students per tutor, but of course it's lower than that 3-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratio. And then there's a question about, do we have suggested materials that fit the skill building for higher impact tutoring? Like Colby mentioned, we hope to have, TA hopes to have a list out later this week with some of the TA subsidized providers, which would provide some guidance there. But we do recommend that you look at your current curriculum for any existing materials that are designed for supplemental instruction, because obviously you want to think about if your core curriculum, which we expect is already aligned to TEKS, has supplemental instructional materials, that may be a great way to go, because then you already know that the alignment to the core curriculum is there. Okay. Last call for any other questions. So I know this was a super speedy webinar, but I hope that it gave you some ideas that you can work with. Again, we would love for you to complete that survey for us to get some feedback on how it was for you. And do look for later today, we will be sending out a recording of this webinar, as well as a handout with all the links to all of and examples of the documents that we shared with you, as well as a copy of the slide deck. All right.